Changing the fuel injectors on a 2018 Chevy Equinox starts by opening the driver's door and pulling the hood release towards you. The hood release lever is located midline in front of the Chevy emblem. Push the hood release lever to the right and lift the hood. Free the hood prop from its receiver and swing it into the passenger side receiver in the hood. Use a T30 Torx screwdriver to remove the screw securing the right side of the engine cover. Remove the oil cap securing the left side of the engine cover. Remove the plastic engine cover. Return the oil fill cap to avoid debris entering the oil system. Carefully remove the heat shield minding the ignition wires and air intake to the rear to avoid tearing. Take note of the fuel rail, the fuel injector wiring harness, the fuel feed pipe, and the upper bolts securing the fuel rail in place. More on this in a bit. Locate the 4 ignition coils on the engine. Slide the red clip back on the 4 plastic connectors and squeeze and then pull on the plastic connectors to remove them from the ignition coils. Do not pull on the wire. Stow the connectors under the wiring harness to keep them out of our workspace. Take note of the large amount of dirt and debris around the ignition coils and spark plugs. Use an air compressor and shop vac to clean around this area. Break the torque on the 4 10mm bolts on the ignition coils and turn the 10mm bolts counterclockwise until each is fully loosened. Pull straight up on each one of the 4 ignition coils to remove. Apply more compressed air and a shop vac, making sure there is no debris in the spark plug chambers or around the ignition coils. Locate the fuel injector wiring harness connector leading back to the ECU. Gently slide the red locking mechanism toward the passenger compartment. Squeezing the connector should lift this black tab within the connector that locks it in place. If you are having difficulty lifting it enough to allow removal, very carefully pry it with a small screwdriver and slide the connector back with your hand. Stow the connector here. Place an old t-shirt or rag under the nut for the fuel feed pipe. I recommend burning this rag after the job to avoid spontaneous combustion disposing otherwise. Loosen the fuel feed pipe with a 17mm wrench. Caution, this is under pressure and will spray a small amount of gasoline. Wear eye protection. You don't need to pull fuses and run the vehicle to drain the fuel line, but you'll need to deal with fuel in the rail in later steps. Slide the fuel feed pipe nut back to the rearmost position. Loosen and remove the 10mm bolts securing the top of the fuel rail to the valve cover. Loosen and remove the 10mm bolts securing the fuel injectors to the motor head. During the next step, please avoid compressing or pinching the wiring harness cables found under the fuel rail. We need to lift the fuel rail with the injector still attached to avoid the use of any specialized injector removal tools. Insert 2 10-inch or longer screwdrivers on both ends of the fuel rail as I've shown. The flathead seemed best for the job. Take your time, have patience, and rock back and forth, alternating upward pressure on the fuel rail. Applying too much pressure could damage the fuel rail. At the time of this video, this is a $300 part. This took about 5 minutes of persistence to free. Once the fuel injectors are freed and the fuel rail is easily moved with a hand, lift it out of the way. Any residual gunk and dirt should now only be removed with a shop vac to avoid debris falling into the engine. Clean this area with Q-tips and injector cleaner as needed. Here's a view of the injectors, one of which was completely clogged. It seems the last oil change had an unnoticed spill and plugged the injector. Note, you could have a valve cover gasket leak if you find similar. We need to remove the electrical connectors on each one of the fuel injectors. Gently pry upward on the inner tab of the connector with a small screwdriver and slide the connector off with your hand, and repeat this process for the remaining 4 fuel injectors. We need to remove the number 4 hex Allen key bolt securing the injectors to the fuel rail. Break the tension on these and remove the 2 bolts on each injector, removing a total of 8 bolts. Removing the fuel injectors from the fuel rail may be very difficult. The first injector removed will dump a lot of fuel if the line was not previously depleted. Make sure you have a towel on hand. Confirm the O-ring on top of the injector is not still lodged within each fuel rail head. Each fuel injector will have residual gasoline that comes from the rail. Do not force the removal of an injector as the fuel rail could be bent. For particularly stuck injectors, use a flathead to carefully separate it from the fuel rail. Installing the new injectors should start with applying a light amount of gasoline to the O-ring on the new fuel injector. Do not submerge the electrical connector in gasoline. Insert each fuel injector into the fuel rail until it's flush, with the same prep of applying gasoline to the O-ring. Note that the injectors are installed with the electrical connector facing the side of the fuel rail with the wiring harness connector. Apply thread locker to each one of the number 4 hex Allen bolts and insert them into the fuel rail. Hand thread the number 4 hex Allen bolt to start it and to avoid the potential for cross-threading. Tighten the number 4 hex Allen bolt until there is a slight amount of flex on the fuel rail pipe. Do not over-tighten these. The thread locker will keep these in place. Press each ignition coil's electrical connector on the wiring harness into place, with each producing a light click to indicate it's locked. We are now ready to reinstall the injectors and fuel rail into the engine. Gently slide the injectors back into the ignition chamber. You may need to push the connecting fuel rail downshafts to the left or right to seat these. Reinstall the 10mm bolt on each fuel injector and hand tighten these to avoid cross-threading. Evenly tighten these to avoid binding or breaking the fuel injectors. Continue to evenly tighten the bolts with a socket wrench, moving to another bolt after a few turns. Make sure to watch that the fuel feed pipe seats into place and the fuel rail does not get caught on it and bend it. Use one hand to tighten the bolts and avoid over-tightening. Reinstall the top 10mm fuel rail bolts and hand tighten to avoid cross-threading. Tighten these with one hand to avoid over-tightening. Slide the fuel feed pipe nut back into place and hand tighten. Use a 17mm wrench to tighten the nut with one hand and avoid over-tightening. Back off as soon as it's snug. Reinsert the fuel rail wiring harness connector and push the red tab back down to lock it in place. Press the ignition coils in place, making sure the base of the rubber boot is fully seated in the spark plug chamber, and start threading their 10mm bolts with your fingers. There is no torque spec I could find for the 10mm bolts, but tighten these with a socket wrench using one hand carefully. Avoid over-tightening to prevent a snapped bolt. Plug in each ignition wire, pushing on the plastic connector, sliding the red locking mechanism into place, and confirm each ignition wire connector is fully seated and secured. Return the heat shield and wrap it around the wires, piping, and intake system to the rear. Remove the oil fill cap. Return the plastic engine cover. Return the oil fill cap. Secure the right side of the plastic engine cover, returning the T30 Torx screw. Back in the vehicle, start the Equinox by depressing the brake and pushing the ignition button. With a little luck, after 10 seconds, the vehicle will start like mine. As a note, the Equinox will attempt to start itself for approximately 20 seconds before another manual attempt is required. I found just pressing the ignition button to turn on the electrical system did not engage the fuel pump to prime the system prior to starting. The vehicle will attempt to start as fuel is delivered to the fuel rail, injectors, and ultimately the ignition chamber. You'll need to clear any pre-existing dash lights with an OBD2 scanner. These did not automatically disappear in my case. At this point, you can return the hood prop into the lower receiver and close the hood. Take your car for a spin. I needed to run my vehicle for about 15 minutes at varying speeds before it normalized. That's it. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and consider sending a few dollars my way to support my channel through the links below.